Welcome. No spoilers today, just this. Get somewhere comfortable, turn the volume up, and give this one your full attention. It deserves it.
The locker room smelled the way it always did after a win. Like this one, sweat and rubber and the faint metallic tang of spilled Gatorade, undercut by the sharp menthol sting of someone's liniment. 31 years old, and Theo Marsh still felt his pulse hammering from the game, even sitting on the bench, with his elbows on his knees, savouring the ordinary chaos around him. Sticks clattered into the rack. Someone's phone blared music too loud, tinny and distorted, and nobody bothered to turn it down. Laughter rose and fell in waves, punctuated by the wet slap of towels against skin, the hiss of the showerheads starting up down the hall. They'd won in overtime, a scrappy, ugly, beautiful 3-2 grind that had left every man in that room feeling like he'd earned something. Theo could still feel the ghost ache in his shoulder where he'd taken a hit against the boards in the second period, could still taste the sourness of exhaustion at the back of his throat, but it was a good ache. The kind that reminded you that you were alive, that your body still worked, still mattered, even at 31 when half the league considered you an old man skating on borrowed time. He watched Jonah from across the room the way he always did, carefully, from the corner of his eye, never quite letting himself look straight on for too long. Jonah Reyes was 27 and burned bright, the way only golden boys did, the kind of player who made highlight reels seem inevitable, who scored goals that looked less like sport and more like poetry. Sandy hair, damp and messy, plastered to his forehead, his cheeks flushed pink from exertion, that easy dimpled grin flashing as he ribbed one of the rookies about a blown pass in the second period. Even sweaty and worn out, Jonah radiated a kind of electric, restless energy, blue eyes bright, voice loud and warm as he laughed at his own joke. Theo had spent the better part of 2 years quietly, uselessly, hopelessly in love with him. He'd never said a word, never so much as let himself linger too long on the thought while sober. It was easier to just watch. To let himself have this, the presence of Jonah nearby, laughing, breathing, existing, without ever reaching for more than that. Jonah was straight, as far as anyone knew, dated women, talked about women, and Theo was the quiet veteran nobody paid much attention to anyway, the guy who did his job, kept his head down, and went home alone every night to an apartment that echoed too much. "Marshy good?" Jonah called out suddenly, catching him staring, and Theo startled, feeling heat crawl up the back of his neck. "Yeah," Theo said, voice rough. "Just tired." "Tired, old man," Jonah said, grinning, tossing a balled-up sock in Theo's direction that missed by a wide margin and hit the locker beside him instead. "You skated like you were 20 tonight, though. That back check in the third? Filthy." "Had to make up for your terrible giveaway," Theo shot back, and Jonah laughed, head tipping back, throat working, and Theo felt that familiar ache low in his chest, the one that had no business being there. He was reaching for his water bottle when it happened. 1 second Jonah was standing near his stall, laughing at something Petrov said, running a towel through his damp hair. Theo watched him lift his arm to sling the towel over his shoulder, saw the movement falter halfway, saw Jonah's face suddenly drain of colour, not gradually, not subtly, but all at once, like someone had reached inside him and pulled a plug. The easy grin slipped from his face, replaced by something confused, almost startled, blue eyes going wide and unfocused. "Jonah?" Theo was already half-standing before he even realized he'd moved. Jonah's knees buckled. He didn't so much fall as fold, crumpling sideways, his shoulder catching the edge of the locker with a dull, sickening thud before he slid down onto the tile floor. The towel fluttered down after him, absurdly slow, landing across his chest like something out of a dream. For one terrible, suspended moment, nobody moved. The music kept playing. Someone laughed at the far end of the room, oblivious. And then chaos, Jonah. Theo was there before he even registered crossing the distance, dropping to his knees on the hard tile, ignoring the way it bit into his kneecaps. Up close, Jonah's face was ashen, lips faintly tinged with a greyish undertone, sweat beading cold and thick along his hairline. His eyes were half open, rolled back just slightly, unfocused, fluttering. "Somebody get the medic. O.W." Theo's voice tore out of him louder than he meant, raw and cracking, cutting clean through the noise of the room. Bodies turned. The laughter died. Someone dropped a stick with a clatter. "What happened? Is he? Oh my God, Jonah." Voices collided into a wall of noise, but Theo barely heard any of it. His hands were already moving, cradling the back of Jonah's head, feeling the damp heat of his hair against his palms, tilting his skull gently away from the hard metal of the locker so he wouldn't crack it against the door if he seized or twitched. Jonah's body felt too light suddenly, alarmingly loose, like something essential had been switched off. "Hey, hey, look at me, come on," Theo said, voice shaking despite his best effort to steady it. He tapped Jonah's cheek lightly, felt the clamminess of his skin under his fingertips. "Jonah, stay with me. Come on, buddy." Jonah's eyelids fluttered weakly, lips parting like he was trying to say something. But no sound came. The thin exhale, his breath shallow and too fast. "Medic." Theo bellowed again, and this time he heard the door bang open, heard the pounding of feet, and Coach Alvarez's voice barking orders somewhere above him, but none of it registered as anything but background noise. All he could see was Jonah's face, pale and slack, all his brightness snuffed out in an instant. "Don't you dare," Theo whispered, low enough that only Jonah might have heard it, if he could hear anything at all. "Don't you dare do this." The team doctor arrived in a blur of motion, kneeling beside them, fingers pressing against Jonah's throat, checking his pulse, barking questions Theo could barely process. Someone was pulling players back to give them room, a wall of teammates now standing in stunned, horrified silence where moments before there had been laughter and noise. "Pulse is fast, thready," the doctor muttered, more to himself than anyone. "Jonah, Jonah, can you hear me?" Jonah's eyes opened fully for a fraction of a second, glassy and unfocused searching, and for one strange, aching heartbeat. Theo could have sworn those eyes landed on him, held there before sliding shut again. "Stay with us," Theo said, voice cracking now, no longer bothering to hide the fear in it. His hands were still cradling Jonah's head, fingers trembling against damp hair, and he didn't let go, even as the paramedics pushed through the door with a stretcher, even as hands reached to move him aside. "Sir, I need you to step back," one of them said, not unkindly but firm. Theo didn't move. Couldn't. His whole body had locked up, every instinct screaming at him not to let go, not to let this be the last time he touched him. "Theo." Coach Alvarez's hand landed heavy on his shoulder. "Let them work, son." It took everything in him to peel his hands away, to let the paramedics slide a brace beneath Jonah's neck, to watch as they lifted him onto the stretcher with brisk, practiced efficiency. Jonah's arm slipped off the side, dangling lifeless for a moment before someone tucked it back against his body, and Theo felt something in his chest crack clean down the middle. "What's happening to him?" someone asked Petrov, maybe, voice tight with fear. "We don't know yet," the doctor said grimly. "Could be cardiac, could be a dozen things. We need to get him to the hospital." The room had gone eerily silent, except for the wheels of the stretcher squeaking against the tile, a low murmur of paramedics communicating in clipped professional tones. Theo stood frozen amid his teammates, still in his damp gear, sweat gone cold and clammy against his skin, watching them wheel Jonah out through the double doors, watching the fluorescent lights flicker off his pale, slack face until the doors swung shut behind him. "I'm going," Theo said suddenly, already moving toward his stall to grab his jacket. "Theo," Alvarez started. "I'm going," he said again, sharper this time, leaving no room for argument, and something in his voice must have convinced the coach not to push, because Alvarez only nodded once, jaw tight, and let him go. The hospital waiting room was the kind of place designed to make you feel smaller than you already did, stark fluorescent lighting overhead. Geshers bolted in uncomfortable rows of pale blue vinyl, walls a shade of green that had probably been chosen decades ago to be soothing, instead felt clinical and cold. Theo had been sitting in the same plastic chair for almost 4 hours. Still in his team hoodie, the fabric stiff now with dried sweat, his knee bouncing with restless, nervous energy he couldn't seem to shake. The vending machine in the corner hummed steadily, occasionally rattling as it cycled its compressor. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang unanswered. Nurses passed by in soft-soled shoes, their footsteps a quiet squeak against the linoleum, none of them stopping, none of them able to tell him anything more than the doctors are still running tests, and someone will update you soon, which by now felt like a well-worn lie meant to placate rather than inform. His phone had buzzed steadily for the first hour, teammates texting for updates, Coach Alvarez calling twice, a group chat exploding with worried messages and prayer emojis and half-formed rumors. Eventually he'd silenced it, set it face down on the seat beside him, and able to keep responding to the same question over and over. Asterisk, any news? No, no news. Just fear, sitting heavy and sour in his stomach, and the sterile hum of hospital lights, and the terrible, aching not knowing. Theo, Alvarez's voice tired and low, pulled him from his thoughts sometime past midnight. The coach stood in front of him, still in his suit, from behind the bench, tie loosened, looking older than Theo had ever seen him look. "Go home. Get some sleep. There's nothing more you can do here tonight." "I'm not leaving," Theo said, not looking up, eyes fixed on a scuff mark on the floor tile. "Theo, I said I'm not leaving." His voice came out harder than he intended, edged with something raw and unguarded, and when he finally lifted his gaze to meet Alvarez's, whatever the coach saw there made him stop pushing. Alvarez studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his tired eyes. "You two are close?" he asked finally, carefully, like he was testing the shape of the question before letting it fully out. "He's my teammate," Theo said. Which wasn't a lie, exactly, but wasn't the whole truth either. It was easier than saying asterisk. "I've loved him quietly for 2 years, and I don't know what I'll do if something happens to him." Asterisk? Easier than admitting that the thought of Jonah lying somewhere behind those double doors, tubes and monitors, and the sterile hush of machines keeping him alive, had cracked something open in Theo's chest that he didn't know how to close. Again Alvarez nodded slowly, seeming to accept the answer even if he didn't quite believe it. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll let the front desk know you're staying. Call me when you hear something." "Yeah," Theo murmured. "Yeah, of course." The coach left, and Theo was alone again, with the hum of vending machines and the distant murmur of hospital life continuing on around him, indifferent to his fear. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, elbows braced on his knees, and allowed himself just for a moment to feel the full weight of it, the terror that had gripped him. The second he'd seen Jonah's face go pale, the memory of how light and lifeless he'd felt in Theo's arms. How his eyes had rolled and fluttered and searched for something before going dark. Asterisk. Please. Asterisk, he thought, to no one in particular, to whatever might be listening. Asterisk, please. Let him be okay. Asterisk. It was nearly 2 in the morning when a nurse finally emerged through the double doors, scanning the waiting room until her eyes landed on him. "Are you here for Jonah Reyes?" Theo shot to his feet so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Yes. Is he—" "He's stable," she said, and Theo felt his knees nearly give out with relief. "He's awake, a little disoriented, but stable. The doctors will want to run more tests in the morning, but for now he's asking for someone." She glanced down at a small note in her hand. "Someone named Theo." His heart stuttered. "That's me." "Come with me." He followed her down a corridor lined with closed doors, the beeping of monitors filtering faintly through the walls, until she stopped in front of a room near the end of the hall and gestured him inside. Jonah looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, dwarfed by white sheets and the tangle of wires connecting him to machines that blinked and beat steadily beside him. His sandy hair was damp and messy against the pillow, his face pale, but no longer that terrifying grey it had been in the locker room. An ivy line ran into the back of his hand, medical tape holding it in place, and there was a faint bruise blooming along his cheekbone from where he must have struck the locker on his way down. His eyes were open, glassy and unfocused, blinking slowly as they adjusted to the dim light of the room, and when they finally found Theo standing in the doorway, something in Jonah's face shifted, relief raw and immediate, cutting through the confusion clouding his features. "Theo," Jonah rasped, voice hoarse and thin, barely more than a whisper. "Hey! Hey! I'm here!" Theo crossed the room quickly, pulling the chair beside the bed closer, sitting so he was level with him, close enough to reach. Jonah's hand lifted weakly from the blanket, fingers trembling, searching, and Theo didn't hesitate. He took it, wrapped his own hand around it firmly, grounding, steady. Jonah's fingers curled tightly around his in response, gripping like he was afraid Theo might disappear if he let go. "Where?" Jonah started, voice cracking, eyes darting around the unfamiliar room, panic flickering behind the confusion. "What happened? Why does everything—" "You're in the hospital," Theo said gently, keeping his voice low and steady, the way you'd talk someone down from a ledge. "You collapsed after the game. You're okay now. You're safe." Jonah's breathing hitched, his eyes glassy with unshed tears, fear, naked and raw, across his face. In a way Theo had never seen on him before, not the golden boy, not the star, just a scared, disoriented man, clinging to the one steady thing he could find in the room. "I was so scared," Jonah whispered, and his grip on Theo's hand tightened, further knuckles pale. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't—" "I know," Theo murmured, reaching up with his free hand to smooth back the damp hair from Jonah's forehead, an instinctive gesture he didn't think twice about until it was already done. "I know, but you're okay now. I've got you." Jonah's eyes fluttered, closed briefly at the touch, his breathing slowly evening out, though his hand never loosened its grip on Theo's. "Don't leave," he murmured, voice fading into exhaustion, the adrenaline of waking bleeding away into something softer, more vulnerable. "I'm not going anywhere," Theo promised quietly, and meant it more than he'd ever meant anything in his life. The days that followed blurred together in a strange, suspended rhythm. Hospital corridors that smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee, the low hum of machines, the careful choreography of doctors coming and going with clipboards and unreadable expressions. Theo learned the schedule of the nurses' shift changes, learned which vending machine on the third floor actually gave you your change back, learned the particular quality of silence that settled over a hospital room at 3 a.m, when the only sound was Jonah's breathing and the soft beep of a heart monitor that Theo had started to listen to. Way other men listened to music. By the time they let Jonah go home, officially restricted rest, doctor's orders, no practice, no games, mandatory follow-up testing, something had shifted between them that neither man had the vocabulary for yet. The team facility hadn't changed. Same fluorescent lights, buzzing faintly overhead. Same rubber and sweat smell baked into the walls. Same rows of lockers with nameplates stamped in black. But Jonah moved through it differently. Now, like a man walking through a photograph of his old life. Close enough to touch, but somehow behind glass. He hated it. Theo could see that from the first day in the tight set of Jonah's jaw as he watched his teammates run drills from the sidelines, in the way his knee bounced restlessly when the physical therapist strapped resistance bands around his ankles for exercises so mild they felt like an insult to a body that used to sprint 60 yards without breaking stride. "This is bullshit," Jonah muttered, not for the first time, as he lay back on the therapy table, glaring at the ceiling like it had personally wronged him. "I feel fine. I feel completely fine. I don't understand why I'm doing leg lifts like a 90-year-old man in a nursing home, doctor's orders," Theo said mildly. From the folding chair he'd pulled up beside the table, a paper bag balanced on his knee. He didn't say much more than that most days. He'd learned early on that Jonah didn't want advice, didn't want sympathy, didn't want anyone telling him to be patient. He just wanted someone in the room who wasn't going to ask him how he was feeling every 4 minutes. "Doctor's orders," Jonah repeated, mimicking the flat, even tone Theo always used, though there was no real heat in it. "You sound like my mother. Your mother sounds like a smart woman." That got the ghost of a smile out of him, quick and involuntary, gone almost as soon as it appeared. Jonah turned his head slightly, eyes catching on the paper bag. "What's in there?" "Food. Real food. Not whatever the cafeteria's calling chicken today." Jonah pushed himself up onto his elbows, wincing slightly at the pull of the resistance band still looped around his ankle, and peered into the bag Theo held open for him, a container of some kind of noodle dish, still faintly warm, the smell of garlic and soy sauce cutting through the antiseptic gym air. "You cooked this? Don't sound so surprised." "I'm not. I just—" Jonah shook his head, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. "You don't have to keep doing this, you know, bringing me food, sitting here while I do baby exercises. You've got your own stuff. Practice. Life." "I'm aware," Theo said, setting the container down on the table beside him, along with a plastic fork. "I'm choosing to do this anyway." Jonah looked at him for a long moment, something searching in his expression, like he was trying to solve an equation that wouldn't balance. The politeness between them had thinned over the past week into something gauzy and strained, stretched over feelings neither of them had named out loud, not in the hospital room, not in the days since, not now. Theo felt it every time Jonah's eyes lingered on him a half-second too long. Every time the silence between them turned charged instead of comfortable, but he didn't push. He'd promised he wasn't going anywhere, and he intended to keep that promise in the smallest, quietest ways possible without asking for anything in return. "Why?" Jonah asked finally, quieter now. Some of the usual bravado drained out of his voice. "Why do you keep showing up? We're not even... we've been teammates for years, and you never..." He stopped, frustration creasing his forehead, like he couldn't find the end of the sentence. Theo considered the question longer than was probably comfortable, turning the plastic fork over once in his fingers before he answered. "Because somebody should," he said simply, "and because I wanted to. It wasn't the whole truth. It wasn't even close. But it was as much as he was willing to hand over in a physical therapy room with a trainer 3 feet away, pretending not to listen. And Jonah seemed to understand that, some of the tension easing out of his shoulders as he settled back against the table. "Well," Jonah said, reaching for the container of noodles, "for what it's worth. Thanks for all of it. The hospital and this, and..." He gestured vaguely, encompassing the whole strange, quiet arrangement they'd fallen into. I don't know why you're the one who stayed, but I'm glad you did." Theo didn't trust his voice not to betray something if he answered that directly, so instead he nudged the fork closer and said, "Eat before it gets cold." And Jonah huffed out something that was almost a laugh. And for a moment the air between them didn't feel so stretched thin after all. But the diagnosis, when it finally came, tore through whatever fragile equilibrium they'd built. Theo wasn't in the room when the cardiologist delivered it. Jonah had insisted on going alone. Some last grasping attempt at normalcy, at being a grown man who didn't need an escort to hear about his own body. But he was in the waiting room, and he saw Jonah's face when he came out. And he knew before a single word was said that whatever they'd found wasn't the kind of thing that resolved itself with rest and hydration. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Theo turned the words over in his head for days afterward, in the shower, in his car, lying awake at 2 in the morning, a thickening of the heart muscle. The doctor had explained gently that could, under the kind of extreme physical stress Jonah's career demanded, lead to dangerous arrhythmias. Sudden collapse. Worse. The kind of condition that ended careers overnight, sometimes ended lives. If it went unmanaged, unmonitored, unmedicated. Jonah didn't cry when he found out. Not at first. He went cold and quiet in a way that frightened Theo more than any amount of shouting would have, sitting in the passenger seat of Theo's car in the hospital parking garage, staring straight ahead at nothing, hands clenched so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone bloodless. "Say something," Theo said quietly, after 10 minutes of silence had stretched into something unbearable. "What do you want me to say?" Jonah's voice came out flat, brittle, like ice about to crack. "That my heart's basically a ticking time bomb, that the thing I've built my entire life around, the only thing I've ever been good at, might be over? What exactly is there to say to that, Theo?" "I don't know," Theo admitted. "I just don't think you should sit with it alone. Maybe I want to be alone." Jonah's jaw tightened, some dam breaking loose behind his eyes. "Maybe I don't want you looking at me like I'm something breakable. I'm so sick of everyone looking at me like that. The doctors, the coaches, you like. I might shatter if someone breathes wrong. I'm not looking at you like that. You are. You just don't know it." Jonah's voice cracked on the last word, and Theo saw the anger drain out of him as quickly as it had risen, replaced by something rawer, more frightened, tears finally spilling over as he pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be someone who isn't, who can't. God, Theo, this is my whole life. What am I supposed to be if I'm not this?" Theo didn't have an answer for that. He didn't try to manufacture one, didn't offer some hollow platitude about how everything happens for a reason, or how Jonah would find a new purpose, because he understood, in a way he couldn't fully articulate, that those words would mean nothing right now, would only feel like more people telling Jonah how to feel about the wreckage of his own life. So he just reached over and rested a hand on Jonah's knee, steady and warm, and let the silence hold both of them, till Jonah's breathing evened out enough to drive home. Weeks after the diagnosis were the hardest. Jonah lashed out at everyone, snapped at the team's coaching staff when they tried to talk about adjusting his role, ignored calls from teammates who wanted to check in, told his own mother over the phone in a voice sharp enough that Theo could hear it from across the room that he didn't need her pity. He wasn't dying. He just needed everyone to leave him the hell alone. He cancelled physical therapy sessions. He stopped answering texts. Theo watched him build a wall around himself, brick by brick, watched the golden boy the whole team had loved retreat into something guarded and furious and terrified, and the only thing that kept Theo from feeling completely shut out was that, no matter how badly Jonah pushed everyone else away, he never told Theo to leave. It was almost 3 weeks after the diagnosis, on a rain-heavy evening that had turned the city outside Jonah's apartment window into a smear of grey and gold streetlights that Theo found him in the middle of a panic attack. He'd let himself in with the spare key Jonah had given him, without either of them commenting on the significance of it, calling out a soft greeting that got no response. He found Jonah on the kitchen floor, back pressed against the cabinets, knees drawn up to his chest, his breathing coming in short, ragged gasps that didn't seem to be pulling in enough air, no matter how hard his chest heaved. His eyes were wide and unseeing, fixed on some middle distance, sweat beading at his hairline despite the coolness of the apartment. "Jonah." Theo dropped to his knees in front of him immediately, heart lurching with a fear that had nothing to do with dramatics and everything to do with how much he'd come to need this man to be okay. Hey, look at me." "Can't." Jonah's hands were pressed flat against his own chest, fingers digging in like he was trying to hold his own heart still. "Something's wrong. I can feel it. It's happening again. I can't." "You're okay," Theo said, voice low and even despite the way his own pulse was hammering. He'd learned, in the hospital in the weeks since, the particular cadence that seemed to reach Jonah when nothing else could, steady, unhurried, certain. "I need you to breathe with me. Can you do that?" "I don't." Jonah's voice broke into something close to a sob, his whole body shaking. "I'm scared, Theo. I'm so scared. What if it happens again and no one's there? What if next time I don't wake up?" "I'm here," Theo said, and without fully deciding to, he moved closer until he was sitting beside Jonah on the cold kitchen floor instead of crouched in front of him. Until their shoulders were pressed together and he could feel the frantic tremor running through Jonah's body. He wrapped an arm around him, careful but firm, and Jonah turned into it almost desperately, burying his face against Theo's shoulder, fingers fisting in the fabric of his shirt like he was afraid of being swept away. "Breathe with me," Theo murmured again, guiding one of Jonah's hands to rest flat against his own chest, so Jonah could feel the steady, unhurried rise and fall of it. "In. Hold it now. Out. That's it. You're doing it." It took a long time, minutes that felt like hours. Jonah's breathing hitching and stuttering before. Slowly, gradually, it began to match the rhythm Theo was setting, the panic in his body loosening by degrees. Theo kept his arm around him the entire time, his other hand coming up to rest against the back of Jonah's neck, fingers threading gently through damp, sandy hair, an anchor against the storm still passing through him. "I've got you," Theo whispered, over and over, like a vow. "I'm not going anywhere. I promise. I'm right here." By the time the worst of it passed, Jonah was slumped heavily against him, spent and trembling. His breathing finally slow and even, his face still pressed into the curve of Theo's neck. Neither of them moved to pull away. The rain kept falling outside the window, streaking gold light across the kitchen floor, and in the quiet aftermath, Theo became aware of how close their bodies had drifted. Jonah's hand, still resting against his chest, his own arm curled protectively around Jonah's back, their breath mingling in the small space between them in a way that felt suddenly achingly intimate. "Thank you," Jonah murmured against his skin, voice hoarse and raw. I don't know what I'd do if you weren't here." "You don't have to find out," Theo said quietly, and felt something in his own chest crack open at how true that sounded, how much he meant it, how far past friendship and loyalty this had travelled, without either of them quite naming it. He pressed his lips, briefly, unthinkingly, to the top of Jonah's head, and felt Jonah go still against him, not pulling away, but not moving either, like he was holding his breath, like he was waiting to see what came next. Outside, the rain kept falling, and inside, on the kitchen floor, two men sat wrapped around each other in the wreckage of everything that had fallen apart, neither one ready yet to say the word that had begun, quietly, unstoppably, to bloom in the space between them. The rain had stopped sometime after midnight, but Theo hadn't slept. He lay on the couch in Jonah's living room because Jonah had asked him to stay, quietly, almost shyly, like he was afraid of what it meant to ask, and listened to the house settle around him, the pipes ticking, the wind pushing against the windows in soft gusts. Somewhere down the hall he could hear Jonah shifting in bed, the creak of springs, the restless rustle of sheets. Neither of them was resting. He knew it the way he knew the sound of Jonah's footsteps on hardwood floors, the way he knew the particular rhythm of his breathing when something was wrong. Around 2 in the morning he heard the bedroom door open. Jonah appeared in the doorway wearing an old t-shirt and sweatpants, his sandy hair mussed from tossing against the pillow, his blue eyes catching the faint light from the street lamp outside. He looked younger like this, stripped of the practiced ease he wore on the field, stripped even of the exhaustion that had marked his face for weeks. He just looked scared. "Can't sleep," Jonah said, unnecessary, since Theo had already sat up, already made room. Me neither. Jonah didn't sit on the couch. Instead, he crossed to the sliding glass door that led out to the small balcony overlooking the backyard, and pulled it open, letting in a rush of cool, rain-washed air. He stepped out into the dark, barefoot, and after a moment, Theo followed him. The night smelled like wet grass and asphalt, that particular clean smell that only came after a long storm. The clouds had broken apart, and a few stars showed through the gaps, faint and steady. Jonah gripped the balcony railing with both hands, staring out at nothing in particular, his shoulders drawn up tight around his ears. "I keep thinking about what happens if I can't play again," Jonah said finally, his voice low, almost swallowed by the night. Not just this season. Ever. What if this is it, Theo? What if this is just who I am now? The guy who used to be somebody. Theo came to stand beside him, close enough that their arms nearly touched, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off Jonah's skin despite the cold air. "You'd still be somebody," he said. "You'd still be you." "I?" Jonah let out a short, humorless laugh. "I don't even know what that means. I've been playing since I was 6 years old. Every single thing I know about myself is wrapped up in being good at this. Being the guy who scores in the last minute. Being the one people count on." He shook his head, and Theo saw the muscle in his jaw working, saw him fighting something down. "If that's gone, I don't know what's left. I don't know who I am without it. You're the guy who sat with his sister every day for a month when she was going through chemo," Theo said quietly. "You're the guy who remembers everyone's birthday on this team, even though nobody remembers his. You're the guy who called me at 3 in the morning after your first scare because you didn't want to be alone, and you trusted me enough to ask." He turned, so he was facing Jonah fully now, his voice steady, even though something in his chest was trembling. "None of that has anything to do with what you can do on a field. Jonah, that's just you. That's who you've always been." Jonah's eyes were wet when he turned to look at him, the streetlight catching the shine of unshed tears. "Why do you always know exactly what to say?" "I don't," Theo admitted. "I'm terrified most of the time that I'm going to say the wrong thing and lose you before I ever—" He stopped himself, throat tightening around words he hadn't meant to let loose. "Before you ever what?" Jonah asked, and there was something careful in his voice now, something that made Theo's pulse stutter. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the drip of rainwater from the gutters, the distant hush of traffic somewhere beyond the trees. Theo could have deflected. He could have made a joke, turned it into something easier to carry. But he was so tired of carrying it alone. "Before I ever told you how I feel," he said finally, quiet and rough, "I've been feeling it for a long time, Jonah. Longer than I probably should have. I didn't want to say anything because you're my teammate, because you're straight, because I didn't want to ruin the one thing that mattered to me most, which was just being someone you trusted." He forced himself to keep looking at Jonah's face, even though every instinct told him to look away, to run from the vulnerability of it. "But I don't think I can keep pretending anymore. Not after everything. Not after tonight." Jonah didn't say anything right away. His gaze moved over Theo's face slowly, like he was seeing him for the first time. Not the quiet veteran who kept to the edges of the locker room, not the steady hand that had held him upright through the worst weeks of his life, but something else entirely. Something Theo had never let himself hope Jonah might see. "I've noticed," Jonah said finally, so softly Theo almost missed it beneath the wind. "The way you look at me, I've noticed it for a while now, longer than tonight." A small, unsteady laugh escaped him. "I used to tell myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into things because I liked the way it felt to be looked at like that. Like I mattered beyond what I could do on a field." He swallowed hard. "I didn't know what to do with it. I still don't, really. I don't know how to be the guy who wants this, too." Theo's heart was pounding so hard he thought Jonah must be able to hear it. "You don't have to know," he said. "You don't have to have it figured out. We can just be here. Right now, that's all this has to be." Jonah stepped closer, close enough that Theo could feel the warmth of his breath, could see the faint tremor in his hands as he lifted one to rest against Theo's chest, right over his heart. The same place he'd rested it hours earlier in the kitchen, except now there was nothing hiding behind it, nothing left unspoken between them. "I'm scared," Jonah whispered. "Me too," Theo said, "but I don't want to keep pretending either." And then Jonah leaned in, slow and hesitant, giving Theo every chance to pull away, every chance to stop this before it became something neither of them could take back. Theo didn't move. He let Jonah close the last of the distance between them, let their lips meet in a kiss that was soft and searching, careful in the way that only came from two people terrified of breaking something precious. Jonah's hand curled into the front of Theo's shirt, and Theo's arm came up around his waist instinctively, steadying him the way he always had, the way he always would. The kiss was slow, unhurried, full of all the things they hadn't been able to say out loud. Months of careful glances, of hands lingering too long, of a friendship that had quietly, steadily become something neither of them had the courage to name until now. When they finally broke apart, their foreheads rested together, breath mingling in the cold night air, and Jonah let out a shaky laugh that sounded like relief. "That's been a long time coming," he murmured. "Yeah," Theo said, voice thick. "It has." Jonah's fingers were still curled into his shirt, like he was afraid that if he let go, this moment might disappear, might turn out to have been another fever dream, born from exhaustion and fear. "Stay tonight," he said. "Not on the couch. I don't want to be alone. And I don't want you far away either." Theo brushed a strand of damp hair back from Jonah's forehead, tender in a way he'd never let himself be before, not with anyone. "Okay," he said simply. "I'll stay." They stood there a while longer on the balcony, wrapped loosely around each other, watching the last of the storm clouds drift apart to reveal a scattering of stars. The whole world washed clean and quiet around them. It wasn't a resolution to anything. Jonah's fear about his diagnosis hadn't disappeared. The uncertainty about his future on the team hadn't magically resolved itself, but something had shifted between them, something solid and real that neither of them was willing to let go of again. Months passed in a blur of hospital visits, treatment schedules, careful monitoring, and slow, halting recovery. There were bad days when Jonah was too exhausted to get out of bed, when his hands shook too badly to hold a cup of coffee, when the fear crept back in and threatened to swallow him whole. But there were good days too, more of them as time went on, days when his color came back, when his laugh returned in full, unguarded bursts, when he started jogging again on the advice of his doctors, slow and careful, Theo running alongside him every single time, matching his pace without being asked. Through it all, Theo stayed. Not out of obligation, not out of the quiet loyalty that had first driven him to sit beside Jonah's hospital bed all those months ago, but because he wanted to, because somewhere in the wreckage of fear and uncertainty, he had found the one thing he hadn't let himself hope for in years, someone who saw him, who chose him back. By the time Jonah was cleared to return to the team in a modified role that limited his playing time and carefully managed his exertion, he was leaner than he'd been before, the weight of illness still faintly visible in the hollows of his cheeks, but his eyes were brighter, clearer, lit with something that hadn't been there in a long time. He moved through the world now with a lightness that Theo recognized as hope, hard-won and fiercely protected. The day of his first practice back, the locker room buzzed with the kind of energy that came before, a big game teammates clapping him on the back, ruffling his hair, telling him how good it was to have him back, how the team hadn't been the same without him. Jonah soaked it all in with his familiar dimpled grin, laughing at the jokes, deflecting the sentimental moments with easy humor the way he always had. But every so often his eyes would find Theo across the room, and something private would pass between them, a smile that belonged only to the two of them, born from months of hospital hallways and quiet nights, and a love that had bloomed, slow and aching, in the space between fear and hope. Theo sat on the bench, in the same corner, he always claimed, lacing up his cleats, with the same methodical care he brought to everything, when Jonah dropped down beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. "Feels weird being back here," Jonah said, glancing around the locker room like he was seeing it with new eyes. "Last time I was in this room—" "I know," Theo said quietly, not needing him to finish the sentence. He remembered every second of that night, with a clarity that still made his chest tighten. Sound of Jonah's body hitting the floor, the panic in his own throat, the terror of not knowing if he'd get another chance to say all the things he'd never said. "You don't have to be scared of it." "I'm not," Jonah said, and Theo believed him. "Not anymore. It's just strange, is all." Coming back to the place where everything fell apart, and realizing it's also the place where everything started coming together. He looked over at Theo, blue eyes warm, dimple flashing in that easy, unguarded smile that had first caught Theo's attention years ago, though it had taken a collapse and a diagnosis and months of quiet devotion for either of them to understand what that attention had really meant. "You were here for all of it?" "I wasn't going anywhere," Theo said simply. Jonah's hand found his beneath the bench, out of sight from the rest of the team, fingers lacing together in a gesture that had become so familiar over the past months that it felt like coming home every single time. They weren't hiding anymore. Not really. Most of the team had figured it out on their own, had watched the way Theo drove Jonah to every appointment, had seen the way Jonah lit up whenever Theo walked into a room, and had simply quietly accepted it the way teammates who'd been through something together often did. But there was still something sacred about these small private moments, tucked away in the corners of a life that had once felt too fragile to hold anything good. "Hey," Jonah said softly, squeezing his hand. "Thank you. For staying." For all of it. Theo looked at him, really looked at him, at the colour back in his cheeks, the steadiness in his hands, the light in his eyes that had once flickered so perilously close to going out, and felt something settle deep in his chest, warm and certain and unshakable. "Always," he said. Around them, the locker room buzzed with the ordinary chaos of a team preparing for practice, cleats scraping against tile, laughter echoing off metal lockers, the coach's voice calling out instructions from somewhere near the door. It was the same room where Jonah had collapsed, where Theo had first cracked open the careful walls between them, where Theo had made the quiet, unshakable decision to stay no matter what came next. Now it was simply the room where they laced up their shoes together, where they exchanged private smiles that said everything words never could, where two men who had found their way through fear and vulnerability into something steady and real prepared to walk out onto the field, side by side, exactly as they were meant to be. Jonah stood, offering Theo a hand up, his grip warm and sure. "Ready?" he asked, that familiar dimpled grin spreading across his face, bright and unguarded, and full of a hope that had been hard won. Theo took his hand and let himself be pulled to his feet, close enough for a moment that their faces nearly touched, close enough to remember every quiet night that had led them here. "There," he said, smiling back. "I'm ready." Together, they walked out of the locker room and into the light.